You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Ancient tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthals. All these things we make no apology are the study of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs, no we don't do dinosaurs.
Welcome to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast, episode 40. I'm your host, Sarah, with my co-host, Ken Fader. And today we have special guest, Nicholas Bellantoni, and he's going to talk to us about JB the vampire and all the fun things that they used to do to get rid of tuberculosis back in the 19th century. Get ready to think critically.
Blokes you will see are a staple of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast. I'm Sarah. Ken, how's it going?
Things are going splendidly, Sarah. It's like summer in New England. It's had to be pushing 90 degrees the last couple of days. So we went from winter to midsummer in like a week.
I like that you guys think 73 is winter.
Well, I mean, it is funny when you see it 73 degrees here. You got people walking around in parkas because it's so cold. But we never dress appropriately in New England. It's all right.
That's New England. And today we have a special guest. We have Nicholas Bellantoni with us. He is the emeritus state archaeologist for Connecticut, which means he is the retired state archaeologist from Connecticut.
Hey, Nick, how are you?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. So people would say that Nick is retired, but nobody would ever describe Nick as retiring. He's an active guy. Nick became, how many years ago did you become a state archaeologist, Nick?
Well, I was a state archaeologist up at UConn for 27 years. So, in the late 80s.
It was one of the best decisions, absolutely, that we all made. I was part of that committee that decided. Right. And Nick, you still owe me some money for voting for you, I think.
That's awesome.
There were so many of you on that committee. I can't get to all of you. You're coming up, I think, in 2018.
All right. I'll hang in there. Nick was absolutely incredibly active, incredibly important for the development of a whole bunch of programs in the state of Connecticut. I mean this very sincerely. He was absolutely spectacular. And you will never hear a better public speaker on all matters archaeological than Nick Bellantoni. Really a passionate, exciting speaker. And I'm just really glad that we got Nick. You know, Nick these days is a retired guy. He sleeps about 20 hours a day. Nick, is that right?
Yeah, I try to now. Yes, yeah. It's relaxing.
I was gonna say, Nicholas, do you feel like you're having your eulogy read to you?
Yes, there you go. He was a good guy.
He was a good man, Nicholas. Excellent archaeologist. Sad to see him go. Nicholas, what do retired archaeologists do?
Well, right now I've got 2 book contracts, so I'm trying to work on those. And as Ken will tell you, it's quite a job, and I'm not sure what I got myself into, but I am enjoying it. I'm also doing some consulting. I still teach up at UConn part-time, so keeping very busy, but at a different pace. You know, when I was state archaeologist, I was running around at 7 a.m. I was out the door going somewhere in the state of Connecticut. Now, 7 a.m., I'm drinking coffee, reading the paper, and my meetings are a little bit later now. So it's a whole different pace. It allows me to do things I couldn't have done before.
Yeah, that's great.
Now, the reason we have Nicholas on with us today is because we are talking about a very fun topic, at least I think so. We are going to discuss vampires.
Right, yes. I mean, I thought it was really appropriate. I mean, here we are, this Archaeological Fantasies podcast, where we're talking about all this fake stuff relating to archaeology, all this nonsense. But some of the stories that archaeologists have to tell about their research are every bit as bizarre, as Jeb Card would call it, spooky, as the fake stuff. And this is real deal stuff. This is a story of Nick's excavation of what turned out to be the actual burials of vampires. Well, I'm kind of exaggerating a little bit.
No, you're really not, though. They really were vampires as far as the people who buried them were concerned.
Yeah. So, Nick, let's just kind of hand it over to you. I will ask some general questions. But first, why don't you tell our audience how did this thing come to your attention in the first place? I mean, somebody didn't call up your office and say, Dr. Bellantoni, we've got vampires in our backyard. So what exactly happened?
No, but the state police and the medical examiner's office called me because a colonial graveyard, a family burial ground in Griswold, Connecticut, was kind of accidentally uncovered by a sand and gravel operation. And actually, it happened like this. They stopped work on a Friday. Saturday, there was a light rain. On Sunday, two 10-year-old boys came to the gravel pit to play and have a good old time, sliding down the slopes. And, well, one slide down, two skulls dislodged and tumbled down the hill with the boys. And they freaked right out, you know. And one kid goes running home to his mother, Mama, there's skulls in the gravel pit. And she says, get out of here, you watch too much television. So the kid went back to the gravel pit, picked up the skull, and brought it home to her.
Which, that sounds like something a 10-year-old would do.
Absolutely. So she did, after she bounced off the wall, of course, she called the police. And the police came down and roped it off as a crime scene and sent the skulls to the medical examiner's office in Farmington. They gave me the call when they realized that these were not part of a modern criminal investigation, but in fact, the bone was old. There were cortical loss, and you could see decomposition. So they realized it was old, and by state statutes, they turned the investigation over to the state archaeologist. So really what happened was I was put in a position to rescue, if you will, a colonial era burying ground that was literally collapsing off a gravel bank. And that's when we came upon one of the burials that turned out to be quite unusual, actually.
Right. Now, because this is private property, right, Nick, where this gravel pit was?
Say that again.
So this was private property, right?
Yes, it was. As a matter of fact, yes, it was a sand and gravel operation, mining. The miner was very cooperative. He was kind of shocked by what was found and so forth. In fact, you know, the first impression by the state police when they roped it off was that this might a couple of victims of a serial killer at that time by the name of Michael Ross.
That was a famous case in Connecticut, yeah.
Name of who? Can you say the name one more time?
Michael Ross. He's the last person put to death by the state of Connecticut. And I believe back in the early 80s, he killed about 8 or 9 women in New England. And at that point, not all of the victims had been discovered. So they thought at first it was a criminal investigation, but it turned out to be a farming family cemetery. And that's why we were called in to assume the investigation.
So now, Nick, we ordinarily think of colonial cemeteries in this part of the world as having nice, neat gravestones with urn and willow designs or cherubs. But so there's nothing on the surface that indicated there was a cemetery here?
That's practically right. Basically, there are a lot of unmarked graves. Most people could not afford a tombstone. These were hardworking farmers. What we believe they did have were flat field stones that were set, in some cases, only a couple of inches off the ground, but certainly not engraved. So the miners, when they cleared the land, never recognized that these stones might, in fact, be grave markers.
Huh.
So it didn't look like a typical cemetery, so they just said, it's just rocks, so let's dig it all up. They had no idea until the skulls actually started to erode down the bank. So initially, this starts off as a salvage operation, right? You know, you say, well, we'll get some people in there, we'll excavate these burials and then rebury them. So what was so strange about these graves as you uncovered them?
Well, a number of things. First of all, when I arrived at the gravel bank, I looked up and, you know, I saw 6 dark features coming down the edge of the cliff. And of course, we recognize those as burial features. And at the bottom of which I could see coffin parts and, human remains kind of poking out of the sand. So, we had a whole series of individuals we had to deal with in that first row that were literally on the bank. So when I did that, I looked up and I saw some bricks. And when we started to excavate down onto the bricks, it turned out to be a crypt. And inside was a coffin that had been laid down, row of bricks built around it, with flat field stones enclosing it in the crypt form. When I opened the stone to look down onto the coffin lid, I could see that the coffin was wooden and painted black, and they had hammered brass tacks into the lid of the coffin in the initials of the person laying there and their age of death. I wasn't too thrilled because the initials were NB, and those are my initials.
This sounds like this has got to be a movie. This has got to be a made-for-TV movie with like Ed and Lorraine Warren, and you're the guy in the coffin, and you don't. Oh my gosh!
Well, I have a question about the tax. I have a question about the tax. Is that a normal thing, or was that something unusual?
No, that was a funerary, option, if you will, for coffins in the late 18th, early 19th century. You get into the 1830s, 1840s, they start switching to nameplates on the coffins to identify.
So there's nothing up to this point to make you. There's nothing up to this point to make you think there's anything unusual going on yet.
No, other than my initials. That's enough.
Well, yeah.
But, yes, no. At this point, this is pretty normal stuff, and it turned out the individual underneath was 13 years old, based on the tax number, and of course, when we did the forensic analysis of that individual, it corresponded to the forensic work corresponded.
So it was a young teenager.
Yeah, young teenager. Next to him was another burial. The initials on her coffin were IB, and she was not in a crypt. But next to her was an adult male in a stone-lined coffin where they set flat field stones on end and bridged them, if you will, arched them to enclose the coffin. And the initials on his coffin were JB 55, an adult male, 55 years of age. So we think we have a nuclear family there.
Sure.
Where, a husband and wife and adolescent, probably a son. So JB is our interesting character because when I first saw those stones coming out, I went along the edge of the gravel bank, and it was eroding, and the part of the arch at the head was open. So I peered in and looked, and instead of seeing the back of the skull that I expected to see coming from that angle, the skull was facing me. And I thought that was quite odd because of the fact that, he should be laying on his back with his head, on the back, and so facing outward. So I thought that was unusual. When we started excavating down onto JB's crypt, I found two skeletal elements on top of the stones. That was there was a lumbar vertebrae and a lower arm bone, an ulna. And I said to myself, gee, this guy's supposed to be inside the crypt. Why am I finding bones outside the crypt? And when we opened up the stone arch at the foot of the coffin, there was the feet in perfect anatomical position along with the shin or tibia. But then as we continued to open up the crypt and moved up to where the thigh bones or the femurs should be, they were missing. And as we continued to do this, we found the femurs have been crossed over the chest area. They've been uprooted, crossed over the chest area, and the skull was clearly at this point deliberately decapitated. And the rib bones showed that he had been violated and so forth. Looking at the bones, if you will, the leg bones, the femurs, we could see a fracture that occurred. And based on the signature of that fracture, I'm assuming that this action occurred probably 4 to 5 years after this guy died.
So they dug him up?
They dug him up. He was given a good Christian burial to begin with. 4 or 5 years later, they came back, dug into him, rearranged his bones, decapitated him, and closed it all back up again.
Huh.
So they didn't like this guy very much.
Yeah, that's awful.
Well, the thing we were totally befuddled. We had no clue as to what we were looking at here. And, my first hypothesis was vandalism, that they went in and, took something from this guy. But, as you know, Ken, you can't use negative evidence in archaeology. If it's not there, it's not there. And you can't invent it. So, and besides that, all the other graves that we excavated, and there were a total of 30 of them, none of them had any material culture in them at all. No funerary objects. In fact, the only thing we found were shroud pins. So there was nothing to indicate that this guy should have had anything. And plus, if they were going to vandalize, steal a ring or whatever, they didn't have to rearrange this guy like this. We were really at a loss to explain this archaeological anomaly. And then one of the crew said to me, well, have you ever heard the story of the Jewett City vampire? And of course, I had not heard that story. And I said, I'd appreciate it if you told me. So I'm going to tell you.
Jewett City is another town in Connecticut.
The Jewett City is actually a part of Griswold. It's a little industrial town by the mills and along the Quinnebog River. Started really probably in the late 18th, early 19th century. But it's a little town, mill town, within and actually about 2 miles from where we found JB's grave in that cemetery. So here's the story. In the 1850s, a family by the name of Ray is going through some stress due to tuberculosis, or what they called back then consumption. Tuberculosis was the biggest killer of adult Americans prior to the Civil War. And so what ended up happening was it was epidemic in New England. Nobody understood germ theory. They didn't understand how diseases were transmitted. So what ended up happening is when they couldn't explain the diseases, one option was that maybe it was the dead that died of these diseases that remained undead in their graves and could transmit the disease to living family members. In the Ray family, a son dies in 1849. The father, Horace Ray, dies in 1851. A second son dies of tuberculosis in 1853. By 1854, a third son has contracted the disease and he's dying. And the family is in panic. And they feel the only way, when the doctors couldn't help them, they felt the only way to save the third son was to go into the graves of the father and the 3 brothers and determine which one was undead. And they did that.
Nicholas, let's hold that until we get back from our break, because this is really interesting and I don't want you to have to stop in the middle of it.
Telling a different story to the traditional lines of archaeology, the Archaeologist podcast seeks the stories and ideas that are often overlooked or not considered real archaeology. Video games, anarchism, and archaeology in the middle of hostile areas. Host Tristan doesn't search under the rocks. He destroys them. Available on iTunes every fortnight.
And we are back, and we are still talking with Nicholas Bellantoni, and he is still telling us about vampires. I interrupted you in the middle of your story about the Ray family, and I think they had just gotten to the point where they had to go to the graveyard.
Yeah, so basically, again, what happened was they were unsure as to how diseases were being spread, and when the doctors couldn't help them, the churches couldn't help them. One folk remedy was that the dead who died of those diseases were capable of leaving the housing of their graves and thus spreading the disease to living family members. So they went to the cemetery to dig into the 2 brothers and the father. They found the last brother to die still had, his heart had not totally decomposed. It was kind of cakey. And they took that to be a sign that he was still alive. And as a result, they broke into his chest cavity, removed his heart, and burned it on the blacksmith's anvil, and then dug them back up with the idea of saving saving the brother that had just contracted the disease. But in fact, he would die 6 months later.
Now, everybody's got to understand what Nick is talking about here is not some crappy show on the History Channel where they're making a bunch of stuff up. This actually happened in New England. They're breaking into graves, recent graves, and they are removing the hearts of the dead and destroying them, burning them in a blacksmith shop. They thought that this would prevent the dead from visiting the living and giving them whatever the disease was that killed them. It's amazing that this was happening not that long ago.
Now, who documented the Ray family?
The Ray family came to us from 2 newspaper articles at the time, who actually called it a superstition. But Michael Bell, who is a folklorist in Rhode Island and has collaborated with me for quite a while on this, he has over 40 or more cases in New England where people have gone into the graves of their deceased loved ones to put them to rest. So our evidence of JB was the first archaeological, physical evidence, if you will. But there's a great deal of historic documentation about this kind of activity. You must remember that this was done out of fear and love. These people were dying, and they had no way to stop the disease. In fact, tubercular victims were sitting at farming family tables, dinner tables, coughing and coughing. And nobody's covering their mouth. They had no clue. And so it was epidemic, and people were dying. And again, when the doctors failed them, maybe, just maybe, this was the answer, and they were willing to do it to save the living. This was not Bela Lugosi and bats going through the night. This was a public health issue, and people wanted to know if this would be a remedy to save them from death and disease.
And so the moral of this story is cover your damn mouth when you cough.
I guess. Nick, was this what's called the vampire panic? Is that the term that was given to this period of time when people were really concerned about this?
Yeah, it's also called the New England vampire folk belief. It had a number of terms. It was somewhat clandestine. People weren't advertising that they were doing this. But when you go into town records and letters and newspaper accounts, these things start popping up all the time. And in fact, there were doctors here, kind of what we're often referred to as quack doctors, who were actually advising the families to go into the grave to determine which of their loved ones is mischievous, is spreading the disease. So it's I'm sure the churches were not happy about it, but this was being done more frequently, especially when they couldn't stop the dying and there was no medical answer for it, that maybe just was it. So JB, we believe, was thought to be a vampire, and they went back in to put him to rest. When we did the forensic analysis of his skeleton, one of the things we found were lesions on his ribs that are typical of tubercular victims. So he had tuberculosis, and that was part of the hypothesis of the vampire folk belief.
Do we know what was supposed to be the function of removing his femurs and crossing them over his chest? Do we know from the literature that this was a typical thing they did, so that the guy couldn't get up and walk out of the grave?
Yeah, actually, the literature is not very helpful, except in Europe. European literature talks about that, and they also talk about decapitating. The decapitation is a common form of, putting the vampire to rest in Europe. And normally, what we see here in New England is the burning of the heart. What I think happened was that by the time they came back 4 to 5 years or more later and dug into JB, the heart was already decomposed. There was nothing there. So they had to make a decision. Is this guy a vampire or not? In lieu of a heart, they probably didn't want to take any chances. So just like you say, I think the femurs were uprooted to keep him from moving, and the decapitation was to put him dead.
That's interesting. So how do you know how they figured out which family member was the vampire?
Yeah. Right. What were the symptoms that they were looking for in dead bodies?
Yeah. How did they know?
That guy's the vampire.
Usually it was the heart. They took that to mean that the individual was still alive. Now,
So if they found the heart, they took it to mean the person was still alive?
that's how they interpreted it, that
Wow.
the person still was capable was undead, that the person was undead. And if the heart wasn't there, then the person wasn't. And I think that's what was the conundrum about JB. They got in there, they didn't see a heart, but they had to make a decision. And I think that's what led it to that. Heart removal is very, very big. There's a couple of really fascinating cases. There's a case up in Woodstock, Vermont, beautiful New England town, where a man was married, his wife contracts tuberculosis, she dies like in 1790s. Within a year, he remarries. His second wife comes down with tuberculosis. So the prevailing thought in town was that the first wife is getting the second wife.
Nice.
And so 300 townspeople show up. 300 people show up at the cemetery to dig up the first wife to see if she's undead. And sure enough, she still had a heart. Her heart was still there. So they removed it and they burnt it. And again, the second wife died anyway.
You would think with such a low success rate that they would have, that's a lot of effort to not have it work.
That's how desperate I suppose they were.
That's true. Good point.
To do something. I mean, again, we could be a bit snub about this in the 21st century. We got this wonderful medical technology that, gives us an answer for death and the spread of disease. However, think of it this way. If God forbid, Zika or Ebola, or we get hit with a pandemic that our medical technology cannot conquer, if you will, and we're dying, then basically, you know what? People are going to do irrational things, irrational behaviors out of love and out of fear.
Right.
People already do that, so.
That's what this was all about.
But it's an important point that you made before, Nick. As irrational as it was, if physicians are recommending to patients, you know what, you really ought to think about digging up your loved one and burning their heart because they're giving you these diseases. In a sense, that's not irrational. The doctor, he's the expert. He's the one who should know. And so you take the advice of your doctor.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what was happening in some cases. We have one account where in Rhode Island where a man goes to the town because his daughter's buried in a town cemetery. He goes to the town and he requests permission to exhume her to conduct an experiment. And of course, the experiment is to determine whether she's undead or not.
Uh-huh.
Wow.
Now, I know very little about vampires, but the typical scenario is you open the grave, you open the tomb, and if their nails are still growing or there's there fluids coming from their mouths that they're actually ingesting blood, those are all folk beliefs, and there are explanations for those that have nothing to do with vampirism. Was that part of the vampire epidemic? Were they looking for people whose fingernails were still growing or hair was still growing?
No, they weren't exactly looking for that, but depending on the timing when they opened these coffins up, if it wasn't that long after death, what they would see were changes in the corpse that they buried. In other words, just like you say, they refer to fingernails as being longer, hair growing, and as you say, fluids are sometimes forced out of the mouth. Now we know those fluids are forced out because of decomposition or post-decomposition gases, and your fingernails can't grow after death, but the skin around them recedes, giving an impression of being longer. The same with your scalp. The skin recedes, and it looks like scalp is longer. So when they opened up the graves and they looked at this, these people were still living. Their hair is growing and their fingernails are growing.
Oh, my God.
And they've got blood coming out of their mouth, suggesting they're feeding. and they're bloated. So those physical changes that we can explain today were sometimes felt to be because the individual was still alive.
Right, right. And of course, the progression of something like tuberculosis, Nick, that's a pretty slow progression, right? The people get sicker and sicker over a long period of time. There's more and more pallor, more and more lethargy, and that fits, the notion that somebody is coming every night and draining you of your life forces, but it happens over a long period of time. So yeah.
That's exactly right. And that's why it was called consumption, because you were being consumed. And again, yeah, you still ate, but you got thinner and thinner, pallor, just as you say. It was like somebody was sucking the life out of you.
Right,
and that's
right.
how they interpreted it.
So this folklorist you've been working with has documented 40 cases of this?
Yeah, if not more now. If you really want to read a good book, Michael Bell's The New England Vampire Folk Book, Food for the Dead. It's called Food for the Dead, on the Trail of the New England Vampire. And he does a chapter on our discovery of JB. It was just reprinted, I should say, by Wesleyan University Press. So if you're looking for it, it is the text for understanding the New England vampire folk belief.
And what's the period of time? Remind us. What's the period of time that this is actively happening in New England?
Well, it's primarily a 19th century phenomena, and that's of course coincides with tuberculosis being epidemic. He has found accounts going back to the 1770s, and some now even into the 20th century. But primarily we're talking about a 19th century phenomena. By the time we get to the end of the 19th century, we really start getting a better scientific answer for tuberculosis. Mm-hmm. A doctor by the name of Robert Conch finds the microbacteria, and then sanitariums start to develop, where people are sometimes brought to the ocean, felt that ocean air was good for tubercular victims. Connecticut had a number of tubercular hospitals along our coast, some of which are still standing. So we start getting a more scientific answer to tuberculosis. But
now, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, what I was going to say, another thing happens at the end of the 21st century, and that is that an English playwright by the name of Bram Stoker writes a book called Dracula. And that changes the whole picture, because now with that novel, vampirism becomes evil. It becomes it's macabre, it's satanic. And so while Michael Bell was able to find written accounts in the 19th century, by the time you get into the 20th century, you don't dig into graves anymore. This is taboo. This is evil. Right. And so the whole social network changes here. It goes underground, if you will. That's a kind of a pun. And it becomes clandestine. But it's still going on.
So they're still digging people up in the 20th century because they think they're vampires. But now maybe they're thinking the vampires are more like Bram Stoker vampires and less like vengeful spirits?
Hard to say, because it is coming out of a folklore, a folk theory.
Yeah.
There was a case in Romania about 8 years ago where a guy is digging in a cemetery and he gets caught by security, and they take him in and they say, "What are you doing?" And he said, "You don't understand. That's my uncle, and he's killing my family. I have to put him to rest. I have to save my family." This is less than a decade ago. Right. So the ideas are still there. It's a folk idea, but it's still maintained within various populations.
Two questions for you, Nick. The first is, during the height of this, were there voices, medical community or the religious community, that spoke out against this, saying this is superstition, you should stop doing this?
Absolutely. There were doctors that were saying this is ridiculous, this is superstition. Of course, the churches were not very happy with it. And yes, no, there were people coming out and saying don't do this. But again, when you're desperate, when your family's dying, and getting no other help, maybe, just maybe, this was the answer, and they were willing to do it.
Right. My second question is, you brought up Bram Stoker. Is there any evidence that Bram Stoker was aware of what was going on in New England and may have incorporated these stories into Dracula?
I have read Dracula 50 times, and I do not find a correlation with what was going here. However, Bram Stoker died, and they were going through his papers. They found newspaper accounts from New England and New York that talked about the vampire folk belief here.
Oh,
He was aware of
interesting.
it, but I don't believe he used it. He was aware of it in terms of his research, but I don't believe he used it in the novel. He knew what was going on. He found the same newspaper accounts that Michael Bell would uncover.
Is that right? Okay. Well, I mean, even if he doesn't incorporate specific elements of it, he's got to be aware of the fact, therefore, that this was an ongoing folk belief, folk tradition, that the dead were coming back and afflicting the living. And so just that alone, at some level, has to be informing what he's doing.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think he put it all together with the research he did to create that novel. And he was certainly aware of what was going on here.
Right. So now, JB was the only one of the graves that had been desecrated soon after death in the Griswold Cemetery.
That's exactly right. The cemetery, by the way, was started in 1757 by a Nathaniel Walton. He owned the property next door and bought this hilltop for the purposes of burying his family. We found a deed in the town attesting to it. But Walton leaves, the Fulton family leaves Griswold around 1805. They head out to Ohio when, the Ohio Valley was opening up, and part of that, migration of Connecticut folks out to the Western Preserve. So they abandoned the cemetery. They sold the farm. Another family, the B family, comes in and starts to utilize the cemetery. And of course, this is the one that we find the vampire folk belief in. By the way, we have never been able to determine who the B family is.
Oh my God.
I was just going to ask that.
Yeah.
So there are no birth records, no town clerk records, nothing like that. Huh?
We could not find anything matching up those initials, AB, NB, JB, IB. And when we looked at the town records, we had a number of B candidates. There were Bissell's, Browns, Bishops, Burtons, even no Bellantonis. We didn't come over until the 20th
That's
century.
good. All right, cool.
But there were so many B. We've not been able to actually find. We have not found death records or birth records. We're still searching. We have students that every now and then pick up the mantle and the baton and try to do something with it. So far, we haven't been able to cover specifically who the B family was.
But Nick, not only do we not have their names, my understanding is that none of them would reflect in a mirror. That's a little subtle humor for those of you who Dracula movies.
Well, did they sparkle? That's the important thing. When you pulled the skulls out, did the skulls also sparkle in the daylight?
Oh God, everybody knows that's not true about vampires. That's just modern stuff. So Nick.
Poor Nick.
You got this burial ground with. You say there were 30 bodies, 30 graves.
That's right.
And did you excavate all of them?
Oh, we had to. Yes, they had to be relocated. At that point, there was nothing we could do other than to remove them and rebury them in another colonial cemetery that was marked in the town of Griswold. But they had to be removed from the gravel.
Just a little.
Hang on, Ken.
Okay.
Let's go to break real quick, and when we come back, we will finish grilling Nick about vampires.
Soupcast is just the audio from select episodes at the YouTube channel of Archaeosoup Productions. Mr. Soup brings you a clear understanding of the past in order to truly understand the world around us. Check out Soupcast at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/Soupcast. Now let's get back to the show.
And we're back, and we are still here with Nicholas Bellantoni, and we are still talking about vampires. Ken, what were you getting ready to ask right before I cut you off?
I have a question, but first I was going to mention something that people might not be aware of. Nick mentioned this notion of, what is it, the Western Preserve? So that Connecticut and Massachusetts their Western preserve was in what is today Ohio. And I think it was after the Rev War that they
Now, hang on.
What's
the Western Preserve?
Well, the Western Preserve was a migration of Connecticut folks that went out to Ohio to farm that less stony, flatter soil. When the king gave us the charter in the 17th century to create the colony of Connecticut, the charter stipulated, kind of latitude on the globe that we house, but they didn't understand longitude. And the way the grant was interpreted is that Connecticut owned all the land literally across the continent to the Pacific Ocean.
We want it back.
This thin line going all the way across the continent. So when Ohio opened up, Connecticut folks were starting to say, hey, that's our land by the King's grant. And they started to go out there in mass migration. We almost went to war with Pennsylvania over this, by the way. And if you go to Northeast Ohio today, there are many towns named after people from Connecticut, and some of them are set up like little New England villages because of the same people. The best story about that I have, by the way, is there was a young man by the name of Moses Cleveland who came from Canterbury, Connecticut, a small town in the eastern part of the state, also on the Quinnipiac River. And he went out to Ohio with a group of people and settled in a little hamlet, if you will. They started a little village by the lake. And we have a letter from him where he writes back to his family. He said, my biggest wish is someday Cleveland will become as big as Canterbury. Little did he know he'd have the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. How can you know
no
that?
kidding, right? Yeah,
But no, that was the Waltons of our cemetery were part of that migration.
Yeah, I've been to. There's a town in eastern Ohio called Marietta, which happens to have the cemetery mound in it, which is in my 50 Sites book. I've got to get that plug in, right? But if you walk around that cemetery, it's filled with gravestones that look like they came out of Massachusetts or Connecticut. And on the individual gravestones, person after person, these were all Revolutionary War veterans and their families from Massachusetts and Connecticut who had moved out to the Western Preserve and had established a town. And gravestone after gravestone talks about born in Boston, born in Hartford. And it's as if you took a whole subset of New Englanders and moved them en masse to the wide open spaces of, the Western territories, which was Ohio.
That's right. That's it. It was quite a movement. And a lot of people here thought that the farms were going to fall apart because of everyone moving. But what ended up happening is a lot of the farmers started to buy up land, so farms became bigger here because of the fact that their neighbors were moving off.
Yeah. So Nick, now you've got, as the state archaeologist, as a forensic specialist, you're excavating 30 graves. What happens to those bones? What was the eventual end of JB and NB and all the Bs and all the Waltons? What happened?
Well, basically, part of my job also was to, when these discoveries are made, is to try to make an effort to find descendants. If they're Native American graves, we work with the tribes. But in this case, with the research we had of Nathaniel Walton, I started to network, if you will, with genealogical societies and historical societies. And we found Walton family members actually as far away as Nevada and California that were descended from Nathaniel Walton. And so I interacted with them about how the remains should be handled. And what ended up happening was they came to Connecticut, to Griswold, for a family reunion, and we had a reburial. The Waltons were part of the Congregational Church in Griswold, and Reverend Bynum performed a recommittal ceremony of Puritan tradition, and we reburied them laying next to each other as we archaeologically excavated. So everybody is in the same rows, laying next to the same people, and they were reinterred at another cemetery, but with with a religious ceremony. So we try to do that for all remains. They're reburied according to the cultural prescriptions of the people involved.
So you were able to find someone to rebury for the reburial that actually did a service in the style that it would have been done in the 19th century.
That's right. The minister for the Congregational Church, Reverend Bynum, looked up his prayer book and did it as close as he could, I suppose. But yes, that's right.
That's
we
pretty cool.
Yeah.
Kind of a difficult thing, though, for me, because as a state official, there is a separation of church and state, and I'm really not supposed to organize a religious activity of any kind. So I have to work through third parties to make sure it gets done.
That's silly.
It doesn't. It really is. But
That's silly. I'm sorry.
Nick, here's the major question. These 30 burials now reinterred at this spot. Are there permanent grave markers so that these poor bastards aren't going to get dug up again?
Poor little guys.
Actually, yes and no. They're not individual grave markers, but
is there a family grave?
This is a marker, but not a stone marker at this point. A stone marker was never put up, but it is the graves are in an established cemetery in Griswold, and they are mapped and marked within the town records.
Well, now the actual question is, when you reinterred JB, did you put him back together, or did you put him in the way you found him?
Leave it to Sarah to ask that
question. Back at all.
You didn't put him back at all?
The family gave permission for us to study him longer, and so he has not yet been reinterred. He's the only one that hasn't been reinterred yet.
Wait. Nick, what family gave you permission? The Walton? Not the B family.
That's right, we don't know. But we discussed it with the Walton family because we wanted to be sure they were comfortable.
I think that's pretty damn funny. And you can have him. He's fine. He's not one of those. Right. Now, but it's an interesting question, though. Were the Waltons and this B family, were they contemporaries in Griswold? Did they live there at the same time? Do we know that?
Well, the Waltons, Walton family did marry a Bennett. Married into the Nathaniel Bennett family. And if you had if I had a gun in my head, I would probably say they are Bennetts, but we do not know that. We don't have, we speculate, but we do not know that. But we do know that they intermarried with a family called Bennett. So it is possible that that's the family, but we can't prove that.
I mean, it's like a 1 in a million shot that somewhere in a Walton descendant, there's an old diary or something like that where they talk about the trials and tribulations of the Bennett family, because they're dying in great numbers, and that would confirm it for you. But of course, the odds are long against finding anything like that.
So one of the things we were able to do with JB is a series of other tests now to learn more about him, and we were able to extract DNA from his skeleton. Now, what that allows us is markers that we can now use were we to get a family candidate to compare up and see if we can actually nail it down. So we're hoping that the DNA will help us find the B family.
That's incredibly cool.
I have a question though. How long are you guys? Okay, what are you hoping to get out of JB? Studying him, his remains, I guess. And how long are you guys going to keep him?
Well, basically, the remains were, we worked with some colleagues down at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology at Walter Reed Hospital, and so his remains were sent down there. We have done 2 sets of DNA analysis, but no, we're getting close, and we'd like to find the family first and then rebury him, but if that doesn't happen, a decision will have to be made within the next couple of years. One of the things about the forensic science is it gets better and better. Science, it just gives us more techniques in which to study and learn. And so an opportunity, because of the unusualness of this burial, to do more with it. But he will be reburied eventually.
Are you going to rebury him the way you found him?
No, we will lay him up in the appropriate Christian pattern, which, by the way, if you don't know, is Here in New England, Christians bury their dead in an east-west orientation with head to the west. So the idea is as you lay in the ground, you face the east. And it is believed that on the day of resurrection, Christ will come up with the sun out of the east and literally draw you from your housing. So you have to be prepared for the day of resurrection. That also means when you go to an old cemetery and read the tombstone, here lies Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan's not in front of the stone, as most people think, but actually is behind the stone with his feet moving away. But that's how he will be buried in a Christian pattern.
Because, all these ads you see on TV for, check your family DNA. You can take a cheek swab and you send it off for $100. And in all these commercials, it's always people amazed because they've always been told they are a certain ethnicity, but their DNA says something different. And there's one woman who says, I always thought I was Irish, but in fact, I'm Native American. What I don't want to hear, Nick, is that you look at this guy's DNA and he turns out to be like from Romania. And so he really is a vampire from Romania.
Is there vampire DNA? Because then you could just, put his DNA out there, let people cheek swab it, and then I'm a vampire. I didn't know.
That's your ethnicity.
By the way, those in-house DNA send swab in are not very reliable.
No, it's all kind of nonsense. But my understanding is that you can extract genetic material even from something like the tuberculosis, so you can actually track the specific disease to its genetic variations depending on geography or time.
That's neat.
So I don't know if they've been able, if there are any bacteria left from that the tuberculosis, the strain that JB died from, where that can be analyzed as well. But as Nick says, the problem is when you put somebody back in the ground, you remove any source of information that next year we're going to find we'd be able to extract. And I understand it's a very sensitive issue, and this is beyond the scope of this conversation. But it does mean we lose stuff when people go back in the ground. People can have my bones forever. It's fine. Do whatever you want with them.
But exactly right. And of course, it's a balance between treating them respectfully, but also, trying to learn as much as we can about a very unusual case. So eventually, he will be reburied.
Well, did you track down the strain of tuberculosis and ask them if it was okay to keep JB out?
Yeah, I don't know.
It's
maybe the descendants of the tuberculosis bug.
One of the issues about tuberculosis is that the pathogen persists in soil.
Yeah.
And could persist for over hundreds of years. We really don't even know how long. So one of the things we had to do when we were doing the Walton Cemetery was I would send soil samples from the abdomen and chest areas and have them processed at state laboratory just to make sure there were no pathogens. That everything came back negative, so we were quite pleased by that. But tuberculosis is a little tricky, and sometimes those they could stick around.
So no bone licking at the site.
Yeah, most diseases like smallpox, they die with the host, but tuberculosis can persist.
But that actually raises an interesting question. When you first were entering these tombs, did you use face masks or gloves? Did you do something to protect yourselves from the possibility that there were live pathogens?
Yeah, usually there's no health issue unless you're dealing with metal coffins, because then pathogens really get escaped. But no, that's true. We did. We wore surgical gloves and masks when we did most of the excavating. Not all of them, but we did. Yeah.
That had to be really pleasant to try to do.
The other thing,
digging hazmat suits, yeah.
Right.
The other thing too is the possibility with DNA analysis of contaminating the sample with our own DNA. Breathing on it and touching it, the archaeologist could inadvertently place their own DNA onto the sample, which could really, if we find out JB's from Italy, I'm in a lot of trouble.
But he could be. He could be a paisan. Come on, Nick.
He could be.
The 18th century?
Oh, it's a little
early for us.
But I mean, what a fascinating. I mean, here's an example where if somebody, I think, and I'm not super familiar with H.P. Lovecraft stories, I know a couple of them, but this is the kind of story that if somebody gave me an outline, I would say, well, that sounds like a Lovecraft story. But in fact, it's really what happened. There really were people who, their folk interpretation of tuberculosis epidemics was that there were walking dead who were spreading those pathogens and spreading those diseases to their family members. And it made sense because the family members were the ones getting sick because they were the ones who had been in such close proximity to somebody who had the disease.
Right.
So it's an incredibly cool story and a cool example of how a sane archaeological investigation is open to all kinds of interesting interpretations, and these guys actually solved this mystery. Very, very cool. A great example of archaeology in action.
Well, and it's just cool digging up vampires. I mean, that's...
Well, yeah, come on.
I mean, you had me at vampire. That's really all you had to say.
Yeah, I mean, I just, I cannot imagine the expression on Nick's face when he opens up this coffin and there's the guy's legs. His feet are in correct anatomical position and his legs are crossed over his chest.
Well, I thought maybe they did that to him like immediately after he died, and I was just like, wow, that's rough. That's a rough way to bury somebody. But yeah, 5 years later, I can kind of see it.
Most of the soft tissue would have been gone. They would have been very easy to pluck. Actually, if you look at our notes in the field, one of the things we referred to is that we looked like we were looking at a Jolly Roger, a pirate's across the bones, but of course, once we got into the vampire folk belief, we realized what was going on here.
Nick, who identified the smallpox? The tuberculosis. Where did you send? Was that the Walter Reed?
No. The soil samples were sent to state laboratories in Hartford, but the skeletal remains were sent to Walter Reed. We did preliminary analysis at UConn, but then we sent them all down to Walter Reed for more extensive forensic work.
So they're the ones who diagnosed the tuberculosis.
That's right. That's correct.
Yeah. And just another little side point. When you go through death records and you go through town clerk records, you do reach this period in the 19th century where it's name after name after name after name. When the cause of death is given, it is consumption. This really was something scary and very, very common. And it's just spread like wildfire again, because as Nick said, nobody understood that there were people had these diseases and were broadcasting them by coughing, and you live in the same close quarters with somebody with tuberculosis, and the odds were pretty good you were going to get it too.
Well, I just read a really interesting article on Facebook, actually, about how tuberculosis, the disease, actually affected what was considered beautiful at the time, mostly women's beauty, not so much men.
Right.
But like that whole paleness and the fever bright eyes and the waifish figure, that was all stuff that you got while you were sick. And tuberculosis was apparently so common, especially among the wealthy, that they just decided that was pretty. And so women were going out of their way to make themselves look like they had an illness. I mean, I don't think that they were logically doing that. They were just like, this person's pretty. I'm going to look like her. Oh, she's dying of tuberculosis. Oh, well. But it was also considered very romantic to die from tuberculosis. It was the way to go.
That's right. And you look at all the Gothic and Romantic writers of the early 19th century. They all wanted, or in some cases they did, contract tuberculosis. There was a concept of that beauty.
Yeah.
What's interesting too is how it really has this ripple effect. Arthur Conan Doyle, the guy who writes all the Sherlock Holmes mysteries, I think his second wife, or maybe I think his first wife, had tuberculosis, and so he kept moving around Europe to places where the doctor said the air here will be better, the air on this mountain, the air by this ocean. And so he needed to generate cash. He needed a cash flow so he could keep buying these houses where his wife would get better. And so he didn't really like, and he came to a point where he was kind of bored writing the Sherlock Holmes stories, but it was the thing that generated a lot of income for him. So the reason we have 56 short stories and 4 novels is because Conan Doyle would say, well, I need a bunch of money to put down in a new house so my wife, who's got tuberculosis, will survive. I better crank out some more Sherlock Holmes stories. So we have that many because he needed to generate income so he could take care of his wife.
Well, I knew that he brought the character back after the Reichenbach Falls because of popular demand. I didn't realize it was because his wife was also sick. So that things you learn on the Archaeofantasies podcast.
That ultimately this was all about. He loved writing, and he was really interested in writing historical fiction.
Yeah.
But those didn't sell as well.
No.
They're very well reviewed, but people demanded Sherlock Holmes.
Well, and he wrote some like sci-fi stuff too, and it didn't go anywhere.
Lost World, which actually was pretty good.
It was
a couple of movies out of that. But he certainly understood that for him to make a lot of money, the money in the Sherlock Holmes stories was much, much greater than anything he could do with historical fiction. And so I think he grudgingly went back to Sherlock Holmes because he needed the cash to take care of his wife.
That.
So Nick, thank you very much for coming on to the show. Do you have any final thoughts you want to share with us before we close the call?
No, other than to say that, again, this is not vampirism as we think of vampirism today in the 21st century with Twilight and everything else that's out there. Even
no sparkly vampires.
All right. But this was a public health issue and people were responding to that. And while it seems strange to us today, back then, it was a possible way to save their loved ones.
This is Nick. Thank you so very much. It's a fascinating piece of research and a story extremely well told. So thanks for participating.
Yeah, this was great. It was really, really cool to hear this story.
Yeah, no kidding. So thank you, Nick, and have a great evening. And I'll talk to you soon.
All right.
Well, thanks for having me.
As one will call. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
Thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it. Our music was provided by Archaeology Productions. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Stitcher and share us wherever you use social media. You can contact us with your questions, comments, or angry email at archaeofantasies@gmail.com. You can follow the podcast at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archaeofantasies. You can follow the blog at www.archaeofantasies.com and get updates on Tumblr and Twitter at Archaeofantasies. You can also look for us on Facebook. If you're looking for the show notes for this episode, go to the podcast website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archaeofantasies. Thanks again for listening.
No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. We don't do dinosaurs.
This show is produced by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.